The morning light over Montgomery carried a soft haze that blurred the edges of the city, giving everything a muted gold glow that made even the cracked sidewalks look warm. Georgia Gilmore stepped out of the small wooden house she shared with her children and breathed in the scent of wet earth. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant rumble of buses heading toward downtown. The same buses where she and every other black rider were expected to enter in the back and surrender their seats without complaint. She watched one pass by, watched the shadowy outlines of passengers inside, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She wanted her children to grow up in a different world, a place with fewer lines drawn in chalk that hardened into walls. Yet the world she lived in did not leave much space for dreams. Georgia had always been restless in a way that confused her teachers. As a girl, she asked questions that seemed too large for the narrow classrooms of Montgomery's segregated schools. She wanted to know why her textbooks were torn and why the schools across town received new ones every year. She wanted to know why certain professions were proudly displayed in career day posters while others were quietly omitted for girls like her. When a teacher once said she had a sharp mind for numbers, Georgia carried those words home like a treasure. But sharp minds did not erase the weight of poverty. She began working young, not because she wanted to, but because the house had needs that her mother's wages could never meet. By the time she reached her late teens, Georgia understood clearly that college was a luxury far beyond her reach. She could not afford books or tuition, and even if she could, segregation ensured that opportunities remained limited. Still, she hung on to the idea that learning was a path toward change. She took night classes when she could and saved coins in a tin hidden beneath her mattress, adding whatever she earned from sewing jobs and kitchen work. The more she worked, the more she realized the math did not add up. Costs rose faster than her wages. Every dream felt like it required a payment she could not make. One evening, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands covered in flour, Georgia folded dough with steady movements that had become second nature. Cooking came easily to her. It reminded her of her mother, who taught her that feeding others was both a duty and a language. Food eased tension, built bridges, and softened quarrels. Food could coax laughter out of a room bruised by fear. Sometimes Georgia imagined owning her own restaurant, a place filled with steam and the smell of buttered crusts, a place where she could serve anyone who walked through the door without asking them to justify their presence. That dream was as daring as it was impossible, yet she held on to it anyway. As she shaped a row of sweet potato pies, she stopped to consider the tin under her mattress and the tiny sum it contained. Tuition seemed like a mountain, but mountains could be moved a handful of dirt at a time. She looked at the pies arranged on the counter, their golden tops glistening in the lamplight. A quiet idea formed. People in the neighborhood always praised her cooking, and some had said they would pay for it if she ever decided to sell. She needed income, and she needed it soon. She wiped her hands on her apron and said aloud, "If the world will not open the door, I will find a window." Her daughter, Evelyn, peeked in from the doorway, asking who she was talking to. Georgia smiled and told her she was just thinking out loud. Evelyn nodded and returned to her homework, unaware that her mother had just made a decision that would change not only their future, but the course of history. The following week, Georgia began selling pies to neighbors, co-workers, and church members. She set up no sign and ran no advertisements. Word spread the way it always spread in the black communities of Montgomery, through church pew whispers and family porches where people gathered after long days. Her pies were known first for flavor, then for consistency, then for something deeper. People said her food felt like hope wrapped in pastry. Her business grew steadily, and each coin that landed in her hand felt like another step toward something greater. She collected the money, paid for ingredients, and tucked the remainder into the tin beneath her mattress, listening to the satisfying clink that confirmed her progress. But Montgomery was a place where the weight of discrimination pressed down on every ambition. The bus system was a daily reminder of the limits imposed on black citizens. Georgia knew the rules well and had experienced the consequences of challenging them. When she worked at the National Lunch Company downtown, a white waitress had complained that Georgia spoke too boldly. The manager fired her without hesitation. She had walked home that day with her jaw clenched and her heart pounding, furious that her livelihood could be disrupted by something as simple as refusing to shrink herself. Losing that job made her cooking not just a dream, but a necessity. In the backdrop of her personal struggle, tension simmered across Montgomery. Talk of unfair treatment on buses was growing louder, particularly after Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat and was arrested. Although Georgia did not know her personally at the time, she knew enough to understand that something had broken open. Conversations at church grew more urgent, and whispers turned into plans. Leaders gathered in living rooms, and the first sparks of what would become the Montgomery Bus Boycott began to glow. Georgia listened attentively whenever someone brought news. She felt a stirring she could not ignore, a sense that history was shifting right outside her door. One night, as rain tapped against the roof, Georgia stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the smell of butter and spices. She kneaded dough while listening to the radio report on growing protests. Evelyn sat at the table reading her school book, the lamplight casting a warm halo across her face. Georgia watched her daughter's focused expression and felt a surge of determination. She wanted to give her children a future where they did not have to fight for seats on buses or beg for the right to learn. She wanted them to have choices she never did. She paused her work and looked around the kitchen. The walls were thin, the space small, but there was strength in this room. It was a space she controlled, a space where her hands created something people valued. Her pies had already changed her family's finances. Now they could do more. She realized she could use the same skill that helped her save for education to support a movement far larger than herself. She did not yet know how deep her involvement would become or how many lives she would touch, but she knew this was the beginning of something. She whispered to herself, "If I cannot change the world with my words, I will change it with my hands." Outside, thunder rumbled as if echoing her resolve. The dough beneath her fingers softened into shape, the first of many pies that would not only fund her household, but fuel a gathering storm of resistance. She lifted the pie and placed it onto the pan with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. In that moment, the kitchen became more than a workspace. It became a quiet battleground where determination rose like heat from an oven. And as the rain poured over Montgomery, Georgia Gilmore stepped fully into the path that would turn her home into a hidden engine of change, carrying her story toward the movement that was about to ignite. Winter eased into Montgomery with a chill that crept under doors and settled into bones. A cold that reminded families like Georgia Gilmore's how thin the line was between getting by and going hungry. Her small kitchen became the warmest place in the house, its oven glowing orange in the evenings as she baked to keep her children fed. Hunger had been a companion for much of her life, sometimes loud enough to command her full attention, sometimes quiet but present like a shadow behind every decision. It taught her to stretch ingredients until they yielded more than they reasonably should. And it taught her to work with a determination that left no room for surrender. Georgia's childhood had never been rich in comforts. Her mother, a laundress, scrubbed clothes for white families who often treated her with cold indifference, handing over soiled garments without meeting her eyes. The pay was meager and the hours unrelenting. Georgia remembered standing beside wash basins as a small girl. Dipping her hands into cold water until her fingers were numb, she learned early that survival demanded strength that could not be taught in school. It came from long days, heavy lifting, and the quiet endurance of women who carried families on their backs with no applause. By the time Georgia had her own children, she was determined to keep them fed, no matter the sacrifice. She worked multiple jobs when she could get them, cooking for restaurants, cleaning homes, selling small dishes on weekends, and picking up seamstress work when someone needed a dress hemmed or a shirt repaired. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. As she fed her children beans, cornbread, and whatever vegetables she could afford, she watched them eat with the fierce satisfaction of a mother who knew exactly what it took to put food on the table. Yet hardship had a way of shaping ambition. It sharpened her hunger not only for survival, but for something greater. She wanted to provide her children with opportunities she had been denied. She wanted them to be able to choose their paths instead of being forced into work that exhausted the spirit. She wanted them to have the dignity of education, the freedom of choices that came with knowledge. That desire burned stronger each year, pushing her to expand her small cooking venture into something steady and reliable. Her pies, cakes, and fried chicken developed a loyal following. People said they tasted like the meals their grandmothers made, rich with seasoning and care. Word spread from one household to another, from church pew to church pew, until Georgia found herself filling more orders than she once thought possible. But cooking alone did not shield her from the economic walls built by segregation. White-owned restaurants often refused to hire black cooks for positions that paid well. Jobs offered to black women were usually limited to back-of-house work, paid barely enough to cover rent. And even those jobs could be lost for reasons as arbitrary as speaking too loudly. One afternoon, Georgia sat in the chair near the window, mending a torn coat. The neighborhood outside bustled with the ordinary rhythm of life. Children ran along the street, chasing a rubber ball that bounced against the uneven pavement. Women leaned over porch railings, exchanging news. A vendor pushed a cart filled with peanuts, calling out his price. It was the kind of scene that made Montgomery feel familiar and warm. But beneath the surface, tension hummed. Rosa Parks had been arrested just weeks earlier, and the black community had erupted in outrage that spilled into daily conversations. Georgia listened to neighbors discuss the protests, the meetings at Holt Street Baptist Church, and the call for black riders to boycott the buses. The decision to walk instead of ride had already begun to reshape the city. Sidewalks filled with working men and women who marched to their jobs with determination, refusing to give a single cent to a system that humiliated them. Some walked miles every day. Others gathered in carpools organized through churches and community leaders. Georgia admired their courage and felt the stirrings of something she had not allowed herself to name. She wanted to join them, not just in spirit, but in action. Yet hardship clung to her. Missing work could mean missing meals. Time spent supporting the movement meant time away from earning money she needed. She hesitated, torn between survival and conscience, between feeding her children and feeding the cause. It was a conflict that many black families faced as the boycott gained strength. Participation required sacrifice, The movement needed people who could give time, money, transportation, or labor. Georgia wondered what she had to offer that could make a difference. One evening, she invited a few neighbors into her home, offering plates of her fried chicken and slices of sweet potato pie. As they ate, they spoke about the boycott. A school teacher mentioned that the carpool system needed support. A pastor explained that volunteers were delivering food to families whose main earners were struggling to get to their jobs. A woman from church said the movement needed a place where organizers could gather without fear of retaliation. As Georgia listened, something clicked. She looked around the room, at the plates scraped clean, at the warmth rising from the pots on the stove. And she realized what she possessed. Her kitchen, her food, her gift. She could not afford large donations, but she could cook. She could turn her home into a place where people found strength, warmth, and nourishment. Her hands had built her small business, and those same hands could support the boycott. She thought of her children and how their future depended on the success of this movement. The hardships she faced had taught her resilience. That resilience could now become fuel for change. Word reached her within days that leaders of the Montgomery Improvement Association were meeting privately in homes across the city. Georgia offered her kitchen without hesitation. What began as small gatherings soon expanded as more people learned that her food was not only delicious, but prepared with care and secrecy. Her house became a quiet hub where volunteers could rest and strategize. She cooked for them late into the night, delivering meals to meetings and raising money by selling her dishes to support the movement. Her fried chicken became legendary among the boycott supporters, providing both nourishment and profit. As she worked, Georgia felt her determination solidify. Hunger had once meant empty plates and difficult choices, but now it meant something else. It meant the hunger for justice, the hunger for dignity, the hunger for a world where her children would not have to fight the same battles she did. Hardship had shaped her, but it had not defeated her. Instead, it gave her a skill and a strength that became tools of resistance. Every pot she stirred and every pie she baked felt like a step toward a better future. She might not have been able to afford college, but she found a way to lift herself and others through the same skill that kept her family alive. Her determination tasted of spices, flour, and hope, rising like heat from her kitchen and spreading into the movement that was gaining momentum with every passing day. And, as Montgomery braced itself for the long fight ahead, Georgia Gilmore prepared to stand in the center of it, armed not with speeches or political power, but with the steady labor of her hands and the unbreakable resolve that hardship had forged within her. The Montgomery winter of 1955 settled over the city with a sharp bite. But inside Georgia Gilmore's kitchen, the air stayed warm, thick with the smell of frying chicken, simmering greens, and sweet spices rising from freshly baked pies. The small house on Dericote Street never felt large. Yet during the early days of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, it became a place where the walls seemed to stretch to accommodate whoever needed a meal, a plan, or a moment of relief from the weight of the movement. The kitchen was never silent anymore. Pots clattered, voices rose and fell in intense conversation, and footsteps crossed her linoleum floor at all hours of the day. Georgia stood at the stove with an apron tied around her waist, her movements quick and practiced. She worked with the same confidence she had always possessed. But now there was a deeper purpose behind every slice of pie and every pan of cornbread. What had begun as a way to support her children had grown into something far larger. Her home had become both refuge and headquarters. a quiet center of the rising storm that was reshaping Montgomery. The boycott had officially begun on December 5th, just 4 days after Rosa Parks' arrest, and its impact was immediate. The buses rolled through the streets, half empty, their white drivers glaring out the windows in disbelief. Entire neighborhoods walked to work in clusters, sharing stories, encouragement, and determination. Georgia watched them pass every morning, their breaths rising in pale clouds against the cold air. She felt the same resolve tightening inside her chest. These were her people, and they were stepping into history with every mile. Leaders of the Montgomery Improvement Association, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., E.D. Nixon, and Ralph Abernathy, had begun holding meetings to organize carpools, raise funds, and maintain unity. These meetings needed food to keep volunteers strong and morale high. Georgia's kitchen quickly became the unofficial catering center for the movement. Word traveled fast. If you needed a plate to keep going, you went to Georgia's. If you needed a safe place to talk away from the eyes of informants, you went to Georgia's. Her home became a crossroads where strategy and sustenance met. On any given night, the kitchen filled with the voices of ministers, laborers, teachers, and neighbors. Some came in carrying crates of produce. Others arrived with news from the city or updates from the MIA. Georgia listened as she cooked, stirring pots while absorbing every detail. Even when she kept her hands busy, her mind stayed sharp. She knew the risks. Homes had already been bombed, including Dr. King's. White city officials were preparing legal challenges, arrests, and intimidation tactics. But fear never pushed her back. Instead, it fueled her determination. She told anyone who hesitated, "We did not come this far to turn around." Late one evening, after a long day of boycotters walking through the cold, Georgia served plates of chicken and biscuits to a small group of men gathered around her table. They discussed the growing pressure from the city, the threats of mass arrests, and the increasing hostility from bus station employees. One man argued that continuing the boycott might destroy families financially. Another insisted that backing down would destroy their dignity instead. Dr. King, seated quietly at the end of the table, looked up and thanked Georgia for the meal, before saying that the struggle required every ounce of courage they could muster. Georgia wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. "You are fighting with your words," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I am fighting with what I got, and I am not stopping." The room fell silent as the men looked at her. She was not a minister, not a prominent organizer, not someone whose name appeared in newspapers. Yet she spoke with an authority that came from living the realities they debated. Her kitchen was more than a place to eat. It was the beating heart of a community refusing to accept injustice. That night marked the first time anyone suggested formalizing her role. Dr. King smiled and told her, "Sister Gilmore, your food is keeping this movement alive." E.D. Nixon agreed, saying she should manage the fundraising through her cooking. Georgia nodded, already thinking about how to expand her efforts. She knew she could raise more money selling meals than she ever could through traditional donations, and she knew exactly how to do it. As the boycott intensified, she formed a group of women known as the Club from Nowhere. The group operated in secrecy to protect its members from retaliation. They baked pies, cakes, and fried chicken, selling them in homes, beauty shops, and workplaces. When customers asked where the delicious food came from, the women replied, "Nowhere." The money they raised went directly into supporting the carpools and legal efforts that kept the boycott alive. Her kitchen transformed into the club's headquarters. Women arrived with flour dusted across their dresses, talking quickly about orders and delivery routes while Georgia coordinated the next steps. She kept careful records, storing funds in flour jars and coffee tins that looked ordinary enough to avoid suspicion. Men from the movement arrived to pick up food for meetings, greeting her with gratitude before hurrying off to deliver meals to tired volunteers. Georgia worked without pause, often falling asleep still wearing her apron, only to rise with the sun and begin again. Despite the constant activity, her kitchen remained a sanctuary. People laughed there. People cried there. People shared their fears and hopes as they sipped sweet tea or ate plates of steaming food. Georgia often looked around the room and saw the movement reflected in the faces of those gathered. Teachers worried about their students walking long distances. Mechanics volunteered to fix cars used in carpools. Mothers came with stories of children asking why they still had to sit in the back of buses. Each person brought something to the table, and Georgia made sure they had the strength to keep giving. There were moments of danger. Police cruisers sometimes idled near her home longer than necessary. Whispers circulated about informants looking for places where movement leaders gathered. Yet no one inside her kitchen ever spoke of turning back. The boycott had become more than a protest. It was a symbol, a declaration of their worth. Georgia felt pride knowing her home helped give that symbol strength. One night, after the last dish had been washed and the last volunteer had left, Georgia sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a small clock on the wall. She looked at her hands, cracked from constant work, and felt exhaustion wash over her. But beneath it lay something else, something powerful. She felt the growing understanding that her kitchen had become more than a source of income. It had become a command center for resistance, a place where ordinary people found extraordinary courage. Outside, Montgomery lay still, unaware of the strength rising from a small home on Dericote Street. But Georgia knew. She could feel the change moving through the city like a slow but unstoppable tide. She blew out the lamp and stood ready to continue the fight the next morning. The kitchen that once fed her family was now feeding a revolution, and she intended to keep it burning until justice had its due. By early 1956, the Montgomery Bus Boycott had stretched far longer than city leaders or bus officials ever imagined. What they once dismissed as a brief protest had grown into a disciplined movement that refused to bend. The pressure on black families increased each week, and the white establishment responded with fines, threats, and intimidation. Yet inside the small homes, scattered through Montgomery's black neighborhoods, determination remained unshaken. In Georgia Gilmore's kitchen, where the stove never cooled and the air always smelled of spices, the movement's secret lifeline continued to grow. Georgia wiped sweat from her face with the back of her hand as she pulled a tray of golden pies from the oven. The heat felt relentless, even in winter, but she welcomed it. The warmth reminded her that every pie, every chicken leg, every pot of greens brought the movement one step closer to success. The club from nowhere had become a quiet force inside the boycott, operating in the shadows while others stood at podiums or led marches. Georgia's home served as the center of their covert operations, a place where strategy and secrecy shared space, with the comforting scent of homemade food. The name still amused her. When customers asked who cooked the meals, the women always answered, "Nowhere." The reply protected them. White employers could fire them, landlords could evict them, policemen could harass them. But if no one knew where the food came from, the money could move freely into the boycott fund without fear of reprisal. Georgia kept the money hidden in the most ordinary places she could find. Flour jars, coffee tins, sugar canisters. The jars sat on her shelves like simple kitchen items, though in truth, they held the fuel of a revolution. Late one evening, as she poured coins from a cloth bag into one of the flour jars, Georgia heard a knock at the back door. She paused, instinctively scanning the room before answering. The boycott had become dangerous ground. White leaders had begun targeting people believed to be supporting it. Homes were monitored. Cars were followed. Informants slipped into meetings disguised as sympathetic neighbors. Georgia approached the door with steady caution, opening it only after recognizing the voice on the other side. Two young men entered, both volunteers for the carpool network. Their jackets were worn from long days of driving in cold weather, transporting workers who refused to ride the buses. Georgia greeted them with plates of chicken and steaming cornbread, watching as they ate hungrily. Between bites, they spoke about the growing challenges. Tires had been slashed. Insurance companies had been pressured to cancel policies for black drivers. Police set up frequent stops along carpool routes, issuing tickets for the smallest infractions. Yet the volunteers kept driving, hours before dawn and long after nightfall, determined not to let the boycott collapse. One of the young men placed an envelope on the table. "This came from the Church Street group," he said. "They said it's to help with ingredients for the next round." Georgia nodded and tucked the envelope into a jar. The jar looked no different than before. Anyone entering the kitchen would have thought it held nothing more than flour waiting to be scooped for biscuits. The secrecy was both necessary and symbolic. It reminded her that the movement was built on the sacrifices of ordinary people, whose names would never appear in newspapers, but whose hands held it together. As the men prepared to leave, Georgia stepped outside with them. The street was quiet. The air thick with the stillness of a late winter night, she felt the tension that hung in the darkness. Everyone involved in the boycott felt it. It was in the way porch lights flickered off when unknown cars passed, in the way neighbors exchanged short glances before speaking, in the way people paused before opening their doors. The city had become a place where secrets moved like smoke, visible only to those who knew where to look. Georgia returned inside and set to work again. Her kitchen felt alive with the hum of the movement. She filled order lists, checked supplies, and made notes about deliveries. Women from the club from nowhere arrived in pairs, carrying baskets of baked goods wrapped carefully in cloth. They spoke in quiet tones, discussing which neighborhoods needed deliveries and which workplaces were safe for selling. Some of the women were domestics who risked losing their jobs for participating. Others were cooks like Georgia, who depended on every sale to support their families. Yet every one of them returned week after week, carrying trays of food and envelopes of neatly counted money. The air held stories that never made it to public speeches. One woman spoke of a co-worker who warned her that the boss suspected she was involved in the boycott. Another shared that her landlord had threatened to raise her rent after hearing her discuss the movement. Yet, none of them backed down. They met in Georgia's kitchen with the steady resolve of people who understood that their struggle was larger than fear. They were raising money not for themselves, but for the thousands walking miles each day, and for the leaders fighting court battles that could change the nation. Throughout the spring, Georgia's home remained a constant refuge. Dr. King visited on several occasions, thanking her for her work and lifting the spirits of volunteers gathered around her table. He always spoke with calm conviction, even as threats against him increased. His home had been bombed. He had been arrested. Yet he continued to preach nonviolence and unity. Georgia admired his courage, but she also knew that movement survived not only through speeches, but through support systems like her kitchen that kept everyone standing. Sometimes late at night, when the jars were full and the kitchen finally quiet, Georgia allowed herself a moment of reflection. She looked at the jars lined against the wall and thought about the hands that contributed to them. Every coin represented a choice someone made to resist injustice. Every bill represented a mile walked, a risk taken, a sacrifice given. The jars looked ordinary, but they held the heartbeat of Montgomery. She often thought about the word freedom and how she had never expected to fight for it with flour and frying pans. Yet here she was, storing money in jars and distributing meals in secret, constructing the scaffolding of a movement that demanded the attention of the world. She could feel the tension tightening across the city, a sense that the boycott was approaching a critical moment. The courts were moving slowly. Police harassment was increasing. White leaders were growing desperate to end the protest, but the people were holding strong. One night, as she closed the lid on the fullest jar, Georgia whispered, "We are not done yet." The words carried through the room like a promise. Outside, the quiet Montgomery night held its breath. Inside her kitchen, the secrets remained safe, the jars remained hidden, and the determination remained unbroken. The movement continued to rise from places no one expected, and Georgia knew her home would stand in the center of it for as long as the struggle demanded. By the middle of 1956, the Montgomery Bus Boycott had pushed deep into its most grueling months. The early excitement had settled into a steady rhythm of fatigue, discipline, and stubborn hope. The sidewalks filled before dawn each morning with boycotters walking to work in the cold, their footsteps echoing across the still dark streets. Some traveled 2 miles, others traveled 12. But no matter the distance, the people kept on walking. And in the center of that perseverance, tucked inside a modest house on Dericote Street, Georgia Gilmore continued feeding the movement, one meal at a time. With a determination as steady as the rising sun, she rose before the roosters each morning, lighting the oven while the sky was still a deep shade of blue. The first heat of the day came not from the air, but from her stove. She began with biscuits, then chicken, then vegetables simmering in large pots that filled the kitchen with the scent of onions, peppers, and collard greens. Even while exhausted, Georgia took pride in her pace. She cooked as if she were feeding a small army, which in many ways she was. The boycott needed bodies strong enough to walk, organizers energetic enough to plan, and volunteers resilient enough to face harassment with clear heads. Her food provided the fuel for all of it. The club from nowhere operated at full speed by then. Women arrived at Georgia's door with tin pans balanced in their arms and stories from workplaces and neighborhoods where they sold slices of cake and sweet potato pie. Some of them worked as maids in white households, sneaking in conversations with other black workers during breaks and discreetly handing off wrapped pieces of chicken to friends who wanted to buy but feared being seen. Others sold baked goods from their own kitchens, passing along the profits without ever attaching their names to the cause. They understood the stakes. Employers were firing people for even hinting at support for the boycott, but the fear only strengthened their resolve. Inside Georgia's kitchen, the atmosphere often mirrored the intensity of the boycott itself. Women gathered around the wooden table, counting bills, separating coins, and packing boxes of food while exchanging the latest news. They discussed drivers being arrested for transporting workers. They talked about Reverend Abernathy's home being bombed. They whispered about the city's plans to cripple the carpool system by targeting insurance providers. Through every challenge, the women kept working, each movement efficient and purposeful. The kitchen had become a command post for quiet resistance. As her cooking reputation spread, Georgia's role in the movement expanded. Leaders regularly requested food for large meetings, especially those attended by ministers or lawyers preparing the next steps of the boycott. One evening, while Georgia placed trays of chicken into the oven, a young messenger from the Montgomery Improvement Association arrived with a note handwritten by Dr. King. It thanked her for providing meals during a crucial strategy session the week before, and expressed gratitude for the funds raised by the club from nowhere. Georgia tucked the note into a drawer with several others she had received from organizers over the months. She appreciated the thanks, but she did not want recognition. She wanted results. She wanted buses where her children could sit without humiliation. She wanted a city where dignity did not depend on skin color. On another evening, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down her hallway. A group of men entered the kitchen, shaking off the cold as Georgia handed them steaming bowls of stew. They had spent hours transporting elderly workers who refused to let the boycott break them. One of the men, a local mechanic, said he had driven over 60 miles that day, repairing 2 cars along the way. He ate silently at first, then said, "We would not be standing without you, Miss Gilmore." Georgia waved off the praise, insisting that she was only doing her part. But the man shook his head. "Your food keeps us going. Your pies keep the boycott alive." Moments like that stayed with her. She never walked the long miles others did. She never stood behind a pulpit or argued in front of a city judge. Her battlefield was the kitchen, but she fought with tireless persistence. Every pie she baked held the weight of the movement. Every chicken she fried carried the hope of a better future. She embraced that responsibility without hesitation. As summer approached, the pressure tightened around the movement. City officials launched new legal actions, arresting dozens of boycott leaders in an attempt to drain morale. The trials brought national attention to Montgomery. Reporters poured into the city, filling courtrooms and documenting testimonies from men and women who refused to return to the buses. Georgia listened to the reports on her radio while kneading dough. She heard the voices of those she admired speak boldly about justice and equality. She stirred a pot of greens and silently prayed for strength, knowing the movement needed stability more than ever. The boycott's financial needs grew. Gas for carpool drivers, legal fees, meeting supplies, and damages from ongoing harassment demanded constant fundraising. Georgia pushed her efforts harder. She cooked longer hours, expanded her menu, and assigned more tasks to the club from nowhere. The flour jars filled more quickly. The coffee tins felt heavier. Every dollar went into supporting the people who walked miles each day in blistering heat or biting cold. She knew that without this steady stream of support, the movement could falter. In the middle of all the work, Georgia still tended to her children. She made sure they ate before anyone else arrived. She checked their homework. She tucked them in at night, even when her legs ached from standing all day. She balanced motherhood with activism in a way that never looked glamorous, but always felt necessary. Her children saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but they also saw her pride. They learned not only recipes from her, but resilience. One afternoon, after returning from a meeting, Dr. King stopped by Georgia's home. The kitchen was hot, filled with the thick aroma of peach cobbler and the sound of women laughing as they packed lunches. King stepped inside and smiled, saying, "It smells like victory in here." The women chuckled, and Georgia shook her head, telling him that victory would come only when the city changed the law. King nodded and said, "Then we keep moving, and you keep feeding us." His voice carried warmth, but also deep sincerity. Georgia knew he meant every word. As the months dragged on, the movement held steady. The boycott survived because thousands refused to give in, because ministers spoke with courage, because volunteers drove without rest, and because women like Georgia turned their kitchens into engines of freedom. She fed the people who fed the revolution, one pie at a time, never once letting the fire under her stove die out. She began to notice signs of change. White business owners complained about losing revenue. Newspapers wondered how long Montgomery could withstand the pressure. Bus routes ran emptier each week. Officials continued fighting, but cracks formed in their resolve. Georgia sensed something shifting, slow but certain, like the first hint of dawn slipping over the horizon. And as she pulled another tray of pies from the oven, wiping her brow with her sleeve, she felt a quiet certainty that the movement was approaching a turning point. The revolution was still hungry, and she intended to keep feeding it until justice finally took its place at the table. When the news finally broke on November 13th, 1956, the decision hit Montgomery like the first warm wind at the end of a long winter. The United States Supreme Court had ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. For nearly a year, the city had been locked in a battle of wills between its white leadership and the black citizens who refused to return to the back of the bus. The boycott had endured through heat, cold, hunger, threats, and violence, powered by a unity that stunned the nation. As Georgia Gilmore listened to the announcement crackle through her radio, she stopped stirring her pot of greens and leaned closer, her chest tightening with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and triumph. The decision would not take effect immediately. Montgomery officials would drag their feet, challenge procedures, and resist compliance. But the ruling stood firm. Legal segregation on buses was coming to an end. Georgia closed her eyes for a moment and let the weight of the past year settle into her bones. She thought about the walkers who left their homes hours before sunrise, the drivers who risked arrest, the pastors who spoke even as their lives were threatened, and the women in her kitchen who baked with hands cracked from overwork. The victory belonged to all of them. Her stove crackled softly behind her, as if celebrating in its own way. When buses officially integrated in December, the city held its breath. Ministers encouraged riders to walk onto the buses with dignity, courage, and peace. Reporters filled the streets, their cameras pointed at the doors of the newly integrated vehicles. Georgia stood on her porch that morning, apron still on, watching as the first bus rolled toward downtown. Black riders stepped onto the front entrance, took their seats, and faced the city with calm determination. A few white riders glared. Others whispered. But no one rose to challenge the law. Change had arrived. Georgia returned to her kitchen and prepared breakfast for her children, listening to their excited chatter. They spoke about seeing their teachers board the buses without fear, about neighbors smiling in the streets, about the sudden lightness in the air. It felt as if Montgomery itself exhaled after holding its breath for a year. And yet beneath the celebration lay a deep understanding that the struggle was not over. Segregation laws remained in countless places. Racism did not vanish with a single ruling. Georgia knew that the victory was important, but it was only one step in a long journey. After the boycott, many wondered what would happen to the networks and bonds that held the community together. For Georgia, the answer came naturally. She continued cooking, continued gathering people, and continued supporting the movement's leaders whenever they called on her. The club from nowhere dissolved as the need for secrecy faded, but its spirit lived on. The women who had once whispered over jars of money now sat openly at church meetings, proud of their role in the success of the boycott. Georgia used the momentum to reshape her own life. She had been fired from her job at the National Lunch Company early in the movement for speaking too boldly, but she never forgot the humiliation of that moment. She decided she would never again depend on someone else's kitchen for her livelihood. With encouragement from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, she opened her own home-based restaurant, known simply as Georgia's House. She cooked for anyone who walked through her door, including civil rights leaders, neighbors, and strangers who arrived with stories of the movement. Her meals carried the same warmth and generosity as before, but now they came from a place she owned, a place where her name and her food were honored. Dr. King became one of her most regular visitors. He often brought volunteers or staff members with him, telling them that no trip to Montgomery was complete without stopping by Georgia's. Her fried chicken, pound cake, and biscuits became famous among activists traveling through the South during the growing civil rights struggle. Some came exhausted from long meetings. Others arrived shaken after confronting threats in nearby towns. Georgia welcomed them all, feeding them without question and giving them a place to rest where they could speak freely. Her home became a continuation of the safe haven she had created during the boycott. Outside her door, the civil rights movement accelerated. Sit-ins spread across the South. Freedom riders challenged interstate segregation. Voter registration drives took root in counties long untouched by political change. Georgia's kitchen remained a constant through it all, serving as a gathering place for tired souls who needed a hot meal and a reminder of why they fought. She watched as young activists carried the torch with a fire that reminded her of the early boycott days. She never sought attention for her role. She simply continued doing what she knew best, using her talents to uplift those around her. Years later, many of the children she helped indirectly through the money raised by the club from nowhere reached out to her. Some had gone to college with funds her pies had helped generate. Others became teachers, nurses, and community leaders. They told her that her quiet work had shaped their futures. Georgia never asked for thanks, but she listened with pride as they shared memories of the movement and the meals that kept their family steady during those difficult months. Her legacy deepened as Montgomery changed. Restaurants slowly integrated. Schools faced legal battles. Neighborhoods grew more outspoken. Georgia stood at the center of her community, a symbol of strength without glamour, influence without ego. She saw new generations grow up unaware of the days when black riders climbed the back steps of buses, unaware of the long walks that once defined their mornings. She smiled at that innocence. It meant progress. In the final years of her life, Georgia continued cooking until her hands could no longer keep pace with her spirit. Dr. King, who remained close to her until his assassination in 1968, often told others that the movement survived because of people like her. After his death, her kitchen grew quieter, but her name remained spoken with respect in the homes of those who remembered. When she passed away in 1990, her funeral filled with the voices of neighbors, activists, and leaders who knew what she had done. They spoke not of her pies or her chicken, but of her courage, her generosity, and the quiet way she made history from inside the walls of her kitchen. Her legacy outlived the boycott because it had never been about one protest. It was about feeding dignity, fueling hope, and sustaining a community through one of its most challenging battles. In every jar of hidden money, in every secret meeting she hosted, and in every pie she baked, Georgia Gilmore built something lasting. Her work helped push a nation toward justice, and though her kitchen has long since cooled, the warmth she created endures in the memory of a struggle that proved the power of ordinary people.